These days, the game that the rest of the world calls football, but we here in the States call soccer, is experiencing a level of growth here that 20 or 30 years ago, no one would have thought was possible. Data from a number of different sources and collection methods continues to show that, especially among younger audiences, interest in soccer is booming, to the point that broadcasters like ESPN and CBS are throwing down hundreds of millions of dollars every year to secure the media rights to the biggest leagues in the world. We've still got a long way to go towards catching up with what other countries are actually putting on the field, both in the sense of our domestic league and the men's national team, but as a culture, the United States appears to be coming around pretty quickly as to why this is the most popular sport in the world. And there have been a few pretty key factors as to why this has become the case, and one in particular that I'll get to in a minute. But in my opinion, you can't really understand the magnitude of this change in attitude unless you look back at the history of America's relationship with soccer, which I can only describe as complicated. I think that it would be a pretty big oversimplification to say that we as Americans have historically been resistant to soccer, but I will concede that we also haven't been entirely accepting of it either. Early leagues like the NASL were plagued by things like lack of name recognition, and the league whose best players were mostly foreigners, as well as confusion about how to advertise in a game with no natural commercial breaks. Stop me if you've heard this before, but the league also tried to kickstart things by backing up the money truck to international stars like Pele, who were great for ticket sales, but were also well past their prime and not really built to carry the league in the medium to longer term. And this is just my personal opinion, but I also think that trying to grow a soccer league in one of the tensest periods of the Cold War was a pretty bold strategy. Like, I just can't imagine a whole lot of people in Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan's America getting all excited to turn on the TV and watch Franz Beckenbauer. They seem more like apple pie kind of guys, not Apfelkuchen. But despite all that, pretty quickly after MLS started in 1996, bringing in major international stars was once again part of the business model. Everybody obviously remembers David Beckham coming to LA Galaxy in 2007, but even before that, guys like former Ballon d'Or winner Lothar Matthäus, Colombian legend Carlos Valderrama, and others were around to give the young league a little more clout. But yeah, once Beckham came across, the floodgates kind of opened on that front. Thierry Henry, Andrea Pirlo, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Didier Drogba. Honestly, if you put a team together of all the guys who came over to play in MLS, that team would be pretty sick. But the strength of a league isn't measured by what's going on at its extremes. It's measured by how good it is at the median, and in that sense, even when we've had some pretty outstanding players in MLS, our league has lagged behind the rest of the world, and that kind of makes Americans feel insecure. And along those same lines, one of the other reasons that soccer took a long time to get going here was the perception that our country's team isn't very good at it either. And I don't think this is true, incidentally. We actually have more World Cup appearances and have gone further in them than a lot of other real soccer countries. But it is true that we're just kind of one of the crowd, and as a general rule, Americans don't like that very much. Like, to an avid soccer fan, it's pretty clear that that Belgian team that we lost to in 2014 was absolutely loaded. It was actually pretty impressive that we kept it as close as it was, but to the average American who has no idea who Eden Hazard or Vincent Kompany are, losing to Belgium feels like a letdown. And in my mind, it's pretty easy to figure out why that kind of thing happens, and it actually has very little to do with Americans not liking soccer. In my opinion, most of that disconnect has come from a lack of familiarity with the broader landscape of the sport, which isn't an interest problem, it's an accessibility problem. The Premier League, Serie A, and La Liga all play 380 matches every year. The Germans only play 306 because they're weird, but if you wanted to, right now, you could watch every single one of those if you live in the US. It's a smorgasbord, but even 10 years ago, it was not like that at all. Networks like ESPN and Fox Soccer had a smattering of rights to live games, but their programming mostly consisted of highlights packages and analysis shows. It was better than nothing, but there was no way to really immerse yourself. Like, imagine if you only had access to like 10% of the full episodes of Breaking Bad, and had to watch the rest of them as shorter episode recaps. It would still probably be pretty good, because that show's incredible, but not nearly as satisfying as getting to watch the whole thing. And like any really good TV show or novel or any other type of media really, I would argue that sports leagues and seasons are designed to be experienced as a whole thing. So in my mind, it's no wonder that consuming soccer as a kind of big disjointed hodgepodge wasn't really capturing the American imagination. What was missing was someone going all in, and for the purposes of our story, that is exactly where NBC Sports comes in to save the day. In 2012, NBC acquired the rights to broadcast the English Premier League for the next 3 seasons for $250 million, an increase of more than 300% on the Premier League's previous deal with Fox. But getting a return on that investment was going to face some serious hurdles, starting with the big one that we've already mentioned: getting Americans to understand and prioritize soccer. Like, it's one thing to get casual soccer fans to care about the World Cup, which is a month-long tournament that features pretty much all of the best players in the world. But if you're investing that much money, you're kind of gambling that you can get a random American 30-year-old in Chicago or wherever to watch West Brom play Hull on a Saturday morning. And along those same lines, Americans aren't super used to watching sports in the morning, period. Unlike their coverage of the Olympics, which coincidentally had just happened in London the year before, NBC weren't going to tape delay the Premier League matches. If the game was kicking off in the traditional Saturday 3 p.m. window in the UK, viewers on the east coast of the US were going to get it at 10 a.m., which would then be even earlier the further west you went. And, as if all that wasn't enough, they were also gambling that they'd be able to get enough traction with the Premier League in the US to make their $250 million investment pay off. Americans will happily embrace a novel event like the Olympics for a couple of weeks, but 9 months? No major American sports league lasts that long. Even baseball, whose best teams will play close to 200 games in a season, only lasts from April to November. To put it mildly, this was an incredibly bold strategy from NBC, because people can get very weird about changing their behaviors, and can run out of steam pretty quickly if you ask them to change them for too long. And I don't think that Americans are unique in that necessarily, but we are pretty capricious when it comes to our attention. There's definitely a scenario where this whole thing failed spectacularly, and as a result, soccer was effectively made untouchable in this country for good. But that's not what happened. A couple of months into NBC Sports being the official home of the Premier League in the US, there was already talk of renewing their 3-year contract. For both live matches and highlight shows, viewership was basically double what Fox and ESPN had been pulling in combined in the year prior, and in the 10 years since, it has been increasing incrementally the whole time. This was, and I would argue still is, the most successful integration of a soccer league into this country that has ever happened. And in my mind, there are 3 reasons why that was the case: timing, presentation, and accessibility. Like most successful ventures, NBC's presentation of the Premier League benefited from a pretty significant degree of luck. That starts with what was actually happening on the field. I made a video about this a while back, but the 2013-14 season was one of the most famous and exciting in recent memory. Liverpool were in the hunt for their first title in 20 plus years, and first Premier League title ever. And if there's anything that Americans love, it's big, powerful teams being restored to their former glory. It also helps that Liverpool were one of the few Premier League teams that most Americans would have heard of at that point, and that Liverpool are owned by Americans. But that team with Suarez, Sturridge, and Sterling was pretty much the perfect introduction to the Premier League. And right at the center of all that was Steven Gerrard, who was one of several Premier League legends, along with Frank Lampard and Robin van Persie and a few others, that casual American fans would probably have heard of and were still around, even if they were past their prime. I think it was pretty important to have at least a few guys who played with your David Beckhams and Thierry Henrys to kind of serve as the connective tissue. Those were the guys that they would have seen playing at World Cups and have played with on FIFA in the years prior, and from a psychological perspective, having at least a few of them still around would have made this very new thing feel at least a little bit more familiar. But speaking of new things, this was also a Premier League in its post-Chelsea and Man City takeover era, so the money and talent coming into the league at that time was elevating it to a level that had never truly been at before. It wasn't quite at the English Super League levels that it is now, but just for reference, between 1985 and 2005, only a couple of English teams made it to the Champions League or European Cup final. Since then, though, there's been an English club in 12 different finals and an all-English final in 3 of them. And NBC would have seen that growth and made it a part of their strategy, so this is definitely not 100% luck. But had this deal been done 10 or 12 years before, the product that they were actually putting on American TV would have been very, very different. But it wasn't just the product itself that made this deal successful. It was also how the product was being presented. Taking a British product and putting it on American television is not exactly a new thing. Whether it's Downton Abbey, Sherlock, Doctor Who, or whatever else, British television actually tends to do pretty well every year. So with that in mind, I guess it shouldn't be that much of a surprise that the Premier League has found a home here too, especially when you consider what I think was probably NBC's best production decision of them all. In my opinion, a big part of what made all those other shows successful in the US was that they were being presented as their authentic selves. Counterintuitively, I think if you're trying to make something from somewhere else work in America, one of the smartest things you can do is not try and Americanize it too much. And that is exactly the approach that NBC went with in 2013. Rather than shoehorn in a bunch of familiar American presenters, they brought in people with experience broadcasting the Premier League, like Rebecca Lowe or Robbie Mustoe. They didn't shy away from using words like derby or football instead of rivalry or soccer, because if your goal is to immerse people in the culture of the league, using the language of that culture is going to be a pretty important part of that. But in the likely event that Americans did have a little trouble understanding, NBC had translators like the Men in Blazers to run parallel to all the game coverage and help fill in the gaps. NBC were very strategic in who they chose to be the faces of their new partnership, and specifically targeted people who had broadcasts on American networks, understood the culture, and were good ambassadors for their league and bringing it to an American audience. But even with a highly appealing product and the right people in place to present it, there were still going to be challenges to actually getting that product to its potential viewers. It's easy these days to take this kind of thing for granted, but most of the games that NBC were broadcasting were going to be on their streaming service, which has gone through several different iterations over the years, but at that point it was called NBC Sports Live Extra. And in 2013, that was not nearly as automatic as it is now. Carrying that much programming on a streaming platform was a pretty bold strategy because there was no guarantee that it was going to do what it was supposed to do. But as NBC Sports President of Acquisitions John Miller pointed out in an interview in 2022, NBC's ability to pull that off was a big part of their pitch to the Premier League in the first place, and to their subsequent success.
We have the benefit of NBC's production, marketing, technological expertise, which really helps deliver a good, solid product to a wide audience. You know, a lot of people are worried about whether or not their stuff is going to crash. We were the first streaming company ever to stream the Super Bowl. We streamed the Olympics in 2012. So we've been way ahead of the curve on a lot of this stuff, and we have the people in place who've learned from it.
NBC had the right product at the right time and the right people and platform to put it all together, and that meant that for the consumer, getting familiar with the Premier League was going to be pretty easy. And in my opinion, that accessibility, above all else, was what really sealed the deal here. I've talked about this on the channel before, but my first real sports love was the Atlanta Braves of Major League Baseball. Along with the Chicago Cubs, the Braves are one of the few teams broadcast on a superstation that reached all the way across the country, and because of that, there are Braves and Cubs fans everywhere. Whether you're in South Florida or Seattle, Washington, there will probably be Braves or Cubs fans, because for years, you could watch those teams on TV pretty easily no matter where you lived. The Braves teams from that era were usually really good, which certainly helps, but above all, they were just there. And that, more than anything else, was the smartest move that NBC made in promoting the Premier League. Rather than trying to get whatever number of games from whatever league they could, they made things much simpler. One league for one network, and then do that league as well as you possibly can.
We made a big play for the Premier League because we feel that the Premier League is the number one soccer league in the world. We don't want to be the network of soccer. We want to be the network of the Premier League, and that's a big strategic initiative for us.
NBC had three main criteria in bringing the Premier League into its portfolio, the first of which was a wide audience. Not exactly reinventing the wheel with that one, but the next one is exclusivity, which is where you can really start to see the marketing strategy unfold a little bit. There's an important idea in the sports broadcasting industry of fragmentation, which is where leagues split their media coverage over multiple networks, because in most cases, it's just too expensive for one network to buy all of the rights. The NFL, for instance, has something like 7 different contracts going right now with a number of different networks, including NBC, all of which are worth over $1 billion. They can get more viewers that way, and NBC certainly aren't complaining about having the most watched property in American television in Sunday Night Football, but it is nice to have something to yourself every once in a while, which was the whole idea behind the Premier League acquisition. You want to watch a Premier League game in the US? It's on NBC, because that is literally the only place it could be. They are the Premier League network, and the Premier League network is them. And if you're trying to introduce something new to a large group of people, I think that is an incredibly clever way to start. But the league itself wasn't going to be the only experiment. Like I mentioned earlier, NBC was going to air the matches during their actual time slots in the UK, and not tape delayed into a more American-friendly one in the afternoon or evening. But while this new day part was certainly a risk, it was also an opportunity, because you know what else is on at 7:30 in the morning? Nothing. There's no competition in those slots. College game day doesn't even start until 9, so for at least a few hours every weekend, the Premier League has an essentially completely clear road to run on. And instead of shying away from that difference, NBC leaned into it, fully embracing the idea of the Premier League morning and waking up to watch your favorite team with your cup of coffee and their marketing materials. And I think that was super smart. All of this supports my long-held hypothesis that if you have a cool sports thing and you provide abundantly easy access to it, people in America will watch it. So many of the barriers that we think are there in the mind of the average American are either completely made up or are only there until something comes along to challenge them. But the key there is accessibility. I was able to watch all those great Premier League moments in 2013, not as some oil baron who could afford a fancy subscription to a bunch of streaming platforms, but as a broke college kid who just happened to have basic cable in his apartment. I watched all that stuff because I could, because it was there. I wasn't some diehard, but just like those Braves and Cubs fans from back in the day, I became one because I was able to make those connections. Which brings me to my final question. What causes growth in situations like this? And by that I mean, is it the chicken or the egg? I feel like most people or companies or businesses will say that leagues are either profitable or they aren't, like it's self-evident. When the US women's national team was arguing for equal pay, or when everything was popping off in Caitlin Clark's rookie year in the WNBA, the pushback is almost always something like, well, we're not going to invest in you unless you're really drawing a crowd. Like they had to earn it, which I kind of get, especially if the investment we're talking about is going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars kind of range. But I also kind of don't get that logic. Because NBC's success with the Premier League would seem to suggest that investing heavily in something on the front end can actually lead to greater popularity, instead of the other way around. Not many Americans were watching the Premier League before 2013, but it wasn't because they didn't like it. They didn't even know if they liked it, because they'd never had access to it before. But NBC had both the vision to see the potential and the willingness to take on some risk to realize it. But without both of those things being in place, we probably wouldn't have wound up here. If you want people to really go for something, sometimes you can't wait for it to organically get popular. But if you invest in it heavily, do it authentically, and make it abundantly easy to access, your chances of success are probably going to get a lot higher. It's easy to look at the history of soccer in America and think that it hasn't worked, but I think that a lot of the people that have that opinion are looking at it the entirely wrong way. The fact is that the people who were kids when NBC first got the rights to the Premier League aren't kids anymore, and they've grown up getting up early to watch their favorite teams. It's a part of their life now, and with Serie A, La Liga, and Bundesliga all having their own streaming homes in the US now, soccer from across an entire continent has been given a chance to flourish here. And a lot of that starts with NBC. And if the US ever does break through and has significant success in the international tournament, I think we can look back to this deal in 2013 as a big reason why. You can't just brute force your way into a change like that. You need something to happen to capture hearts and minds and all that kind of stuff. And in the United States, that something may just have been the Premier League finally coming to our TV screens. Hi everybody, and Happy New Year. My name is Will, this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we make video essays about sports psychology and culture. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm so pleased that you decided to start off for 2025 here with us. If you enjoyed the video, and I sure hope you did, do me a favor and give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. That helps other new people find the channel and helps me to keep growing this community that's now been going for 3 whole years. That is truly wild to me, but I've enjoyed every minute of it and look forward to what will hopefully be many more videos in the future. From me and mine to you and yours, Happy New Year and thank you.